Constance with a small team who's going to talk to us about history and the present, and a lot of lessons, I think, for the future. And Constance is an assistant professor in socio-technical systems at Minot University and one of our co-hosts. Constance, I think I'm going to just give you the floor already.
Thank you, Vlad. So I was trying to set up my thing. Hopefully you should all see the screen now, the slides, right?
No, not yet.
Oh, sorry, let me
But
change.
while you try to do that, just to say that apologies for the chat. Somehow it's not enabled, so everybody interacts in the Q&A. And now we see the slides. And yes, when you answer, it goes to answered, but we'll try to solve it maybe for the afternoon. Yeah, apologies.
Yeah, we realize it's the setting was not enabled and we cannot change it now. Unfortunately, the editing option for the webinar is closed. Okay, so let me start on this as we don't have a lot of time left. What I'm going to present is a study we did with Vlad, Ingun, and Joanna Litterat, who joined us in the afternoon, where we reviewed 30 years of research on AI and education to look at what we learned. And we had a bit of we decided to use a bit of an unusual method to review the literature because we had quite specific aims. The first one is that we wanted to map what is a growing field. It's a field that is growing very fast, but it's also a field that has a longish history. Not long in comparison to a lot of other topics, but a lot longer than what people imagine. It's a topic that has been researched since the 1990s, and although it was very few papers at first, you will see, it still has a history and people have been working on it for quite a while. The other thing is it's a field that is interdisciplinary by essence. It's really the meeting point between tech and education. And so sometimes you end up having a very limited view of what is being researched there because you see it from the perspective of your discipline and your specific question. And what we wanted to do instead is have a very broad map of what is going on and to have an overview of what was investigated, what is being investigated now, by whom, so by what disciplines in what areas, and how it has changed over time. And so we proposed a new type of review. So it's an LLM assisted mapping review, which means basically that we use two types of LLMs. We use ChatGPT. I'll explain a little bit in the next slide how, but we also use some more traditional natural language processing methods that do rely on LLM. So the same technology as what powers ChatGPT, but we use directly the model itself. I'll be quite brief on the methods because we don't have a lot of time. I'm very happy to talk a lot more about it in another occasion. I've been doing quite a bit of research using AI as a research tool and trying to do that in a responsible and reflective way. So it's a topic I can speak about for hours, but I'll keep it short. And I actually have a talk next week about that. So if you're interested, do send me a message. So the first thing we did was collect the data. We looked at all the articles published in English on Web of Science. We chose Web of Science because it's a quite interdisciplinary database, and it works a lot better for this kind of studies to have one database because then we have the same type of data for everything. And we looked at all the articles that were on AI or artificial intelligence and education or teaching. Sadly, we couldn't use learning because of machine learning. So if you type AI and learning, you don't get anything about education. And we got from there 8,200 and something articles. As you can imagine, most of them were not about AI and education. So the second step, we needed to screen the articles. And this is where we first started using ChatGPT assistants. So they are the model that powers it is the same as when you talk to ChatGPT. The difference is that you use an API to communicate with it and you can set it up in whatever way you want. So you have a lot more control over it, the same way you would with a chatbot. But the advantage of an API is first you can send it 8,200 queries, which is a lot faster than doing it by hand. But it also means you can reset the conversation every time. So you get a lot more stability than you get with a regular chatbot. For this step and every step where we used ChatGPT, we tested it on 100 abstracts. We checked the results, changed a bit the prompt if needed. And then once we were confident with the results with the 100 articles, we deployed it on the whole data set. So we removed all the articles that were off topic by having first ChatGPT summarize each of the abstracts so that we would remove all the hooks, all the things that were more referring to education just in passing. And then we sent back all the summaries and we asked it to tell us what was in education and AI and not. And we got from that close to 2,500 articles. We then processed some of the data. So that meant taking the data that Web of Science gives you and turn it into variables we could exploit. So we use, for instance, the address of the corresponding author to get which region each of the papers were coming from. Then we did some topic modeling. So this is a more traditional method in natural language processing where you plot each one of your abstract in a multi-dimensional semantic space, and whatever is close to each other, it has a similar meaning. So you use a large language model to do that, and then we use a clustering algorithm. One of the limits of this is that when you use these to model topics, each article can only be in one topic, when in reality, a research article can be on multiple things at once. So we then used Assistant we trained for each of the 12 topics, and we set each of the article one by one and asked it, is it on that topic? And then is it on this topic? So that we could have a better overview of the data. And finally, we did some analysis to map the trends, which is what I'm going to present now. We have one more step that is in process, that is a qualitative analysis, and I'll explain just a little bit about that at the end. Okay. In terms of the results, I'm going to present different graphs, and I can't assume how well they will show on your side because I don't know how big your screen is. So just listen to what I say. The graphs are mainly an illustration. I've put little arrows to direct your gaze when it can help, but don't worry if it doesn't show very well on your end. So the first thing is actually a table just to look at the evolution in the number of papers. And the first paper, as I said, was published in 1990s. But the first thing that struck us when we looked at the data is how much it exploded. So from the mid 2010s, it started growing a little bit, but where it's really striking is since 2020. And it completely exploded since then. So this is only half a decade, and you can see how much higher it is than the previous ones. And for the spoiler, it's both an effect of COVID and an effect of ChatGPT. So the trend started with COVID and then continued with ChatGPT just after. We then looked at how it evolved in different regions over time. So what you can see first is really the literal explosion. So for most of the graphs I will show after, we use percentages per year so that you can compare from year to year. Otherwise, everything is increasing all the time. What you have in light green is East Asia. So basically what happened in East Asia is that they are the region, the only one that got really interested in AI and education during the pandemic. And then the interest lowered a bit after and is picking back up. And then the rest of the world really got interested when ChatGPT and other models came out. You can also look at the percentages per year. And what you can see here is that at first it was mainly Europe and a little bit the US that were interested. And then the interest completely dropped and was taken over by East Asia during the pandemic. And now you have, for the last 2 years, you have something that is quite balanced around the world, which is quite good news, actually, because one of the risks is having some voices in some places we don't have their say in how it's used in education. And here we can see, compared to the number of researchers in these different places, it's actually quite balanced. We then looked at what disciplines are looking at this. And first, quite unsurprisingly, it's mainly education and engineering. One thing that was interesting is that in East Asia, it's mainly engineering. So that's the bar in light green. And in the rest of the world, it's mainly education. That's a bit less the case in Europe, where it's a tiny bit more balanced, but you really have a geographical divide between the two literature. And then you have social sciences that comes as a third in most places. We also looked at the distribution of disciplines over time, and you can see, so engineering is in light green again, and education in dark blue. And basically for a long time, it was an engineering topic, and it's only recently that education joined the field. Then in terms of topics, I'm not going to present them one by one. It would take way too long. So what I've done is that I grouped them in 4 groups because some of them are related in terms of the content of the topics, but the main reason I group them like this is because the trends are similar for all of them. So I'll explain them every time I go to a group. The first group is comprised of attitudes. So it's all the research that has been done on how people feel about AI, whether it's students or educators or institutions. All the papers on factors. So usually these are studies that look at what factors will change AI adoption, papers on the impact it might have on education. And the last group is papers on chatbots. So everything that came mainly since ChatGPT, but not only, it was a topic before. You have them, here are the graphs in the same order, and what you see is their evolution in time. And basically I grouped those because these are all topics that didn't used to be very popular, but they have been since ChatGPT came out. They all completely exploded in recent years. If you look, chatbot is the last one. It exploded quite a bit, but actually the more impressive one is factors. There is a mountain of research being done now on what factors can predict AI adoption. And then we looked at how these topics are approached by different disciplines. And what we found is basically that these are topics that are more favored in education, social sciences, arts and humanities, and to a certain extent, life science, which is very different from the next group. So the next group, we have evaluation. So these are all the papers where people are trying to evaluate whether an AI system that has been put in place is actually a tool, is actually working or not. There was also a big bulk of research on how AI can be used to foster engagement or to create a more personalized education. So these are the two other themes. And then the last one that is a bit of the outsider for all of this is about teaching AI. So quite a lot of papers were about education on AI, which you will see at the end is a quite separate field actually. And there, it's kind of the opposite trend as the rest. These used to be quite popular topics, so they were quite high, and they dropped. Most of them started dropping before the pandemic and before ChatGPT, but this has really accentuated the trend. And in terms of discipline, this is what tends to be favored by engineering, life sciences, physical sciences, and life sciences. So it explains also the fact that we had this switch from literature mainly coming from engineering to literature from education kind of explains how you had this switch also in the topics being studied. The next group is a bit of a specific group. It's literature that was on monitoring and prediction. So these were articles where author proposed to use AI to monitor whether students were really learning, whether they were really coming to class, and what we also could use to predict if a student was going to do well or not. And this was a literature that was almost entirely during the pandemic. And I don't have time to show the graphs per region, but it's almost entirely in East Asia as well. So that's really what made that huge spike that you could see in East Asia during the pandemic, with a lot of articles on how you make sure that students are still showing up for the online class. This is also something that was, exclusively almost in engineering, life sciences, and physical sciences. And the very last one is research on reviews and risks. So in reviews, we put together any reviews, meta-analysis, also frameworks, anything that try to give the reader a general view of what is going on. And the other one on risk, I think, is quite self-explanatory. And the thing that was very striking for these two is how low they are. They are really rare topic. The risk has increased a little bit since ChatGPT came out, but it's still not very big. And for 2024, it's actually going down in terms of percentages. It is also a topic, risk, we see a bit more in education, arts and humanities, and social sciences. Reviews are so rare that they don't basically show up anywhere, which is kind of worrying because we really need both types of studies. Okay, the last thing I'm going to show is a bit of a complex graph. This is how we can explore the relation between those different topics. So this is actually based on the Jacquard score of overlap. I won't explain the stats behind it, but basically what it does is that it allows you to compare how much do the topics overlap in the literature, so how many articles cover both topics at the same time, compared to how much they would overlap at random. So the advantage of this method is that if something happens a lot, yes, it's normal, it overlaps a lot with the others. So it takes that into account. And the colors mean basically if something is red, it means that they occur together more than normal. And the darker the red, the more often they occur together. And if it's blue, is that they are more disjointed than they should be. It's very rare to have articles on both. And if it's dark blue, it's even less frequent. And all the cells that are missing means that this was not statistically significant. I'll just show that we have two groups of articles. So you have all the things on attitudes, chatbots, factors, impact, reviews, and risks that tend to be lumped together, which makes sense because this is also the literature coming from education, social sciences, and arts and humanities. And on the other side, you have all the things coming from more engineering and life sciences that are on engagement, evaluation, monitoring, personalization, and prediction. So you really have these two separate fields of study. The only one that is a bit in between is evaluations, because they were so frequent for a very long time that it does make sense that they would show up in both fields. The one that is a bit of an outsider is teaching AI, that does not come up with any of the other themes in any ways that is frequent, which is a little bit worrying if you think about it, because one way to help students use AI is to teach them how AI works. So it's quite interesting that this is a completely separate field. The last thing I'm going to present is the citation. So what we did is also look at what papers are being cited and who is citing them. I won't present everything on this, but I just wanted to show this figure because I think it's quite interesting. And there are two things that get cited really a lot is risks, and a bit lower down the line, reviews and framework. And these are really papers that are missing. And this is really showing that it is something that we need. So if you write a review on the risk of AI, I can guarantee you it will be cited. Please do it. The field need it. That would be a great thing. It also makes it more worrying when we see things like the fact that papers that looked at evaluation are really, we have fewer and fewer of them. And if we don't have reviews to learn from all these findings and these years and years of research on evaluation, it means we are really not learning the lessons from the field, and that's really a shame. The last thing I want to show is we made a little Sankey diagram because I love them. They always look so neat. I have to say it's such a pain to do, so I'm sorry the labels are very small. I'll put them bigger in a second. But basically, what we did is looked in our data sets, all the papers, what disciplines they were coming from. And then on the right, you have what discipline they are citing. So if you look at education in blue, you can see that education is citing roughly equally education and engineering. And then quite a bit of social sciences, which makes sense because in social sciences, you also have psychology and developmental psychology. So there will be quite a bit of overlap there. You get a slightly different picture when you look at engineering. Basically, engineering is mainly citing itself. There might be a historical effect because they were first in the field for a long time. They could only cite themselves. But when you see the explosion in terms of numbers of papers, even in engineering, that is not enough to explain that. And the last one I want to show is social sciences. That is quite nicely split between the three, so between education, engineering, and social sciences. As a social scientist, I feel like I should pat myself in the back, but in reality, it makes sense when you're more an outsider to the field, neither education nor engineering, that you would, rely on both to say something that is relevant. Okay, just some quick conclusions before I completely run out of time. First, on the literature, the first thing that was surprising, we kind of expected it, but I guess not to that level, is how divided the field is. Of course, there are some overlap and there are some discussions, but you really have different discipline regions and topics, and you have two big set of literature. The second one is we have some huge blind spots in terms of risk. Everyone talks about the risk, but there is actually very little research that is done on that. The third one is it's worrying as we have more and more AI being deployed in education. It's worrying that we don't evaluate it as much as we used to. That is really a worrying trend, I find. And the last thing is there might be a slight risk of saturation in studies on factors and attitudes. I'm sorry to say it, but I've done some of these studies, so I shouldn't judge, but we probably do not need another survey on what teachers and students think of AI. There are probably enough of those out there. Please look at something else. Although these are always interesting, so I'm not telling you to completely stop, but we have a lot of those. And just a very quick conclusion on the methods, because we've done iterations of this before in a much more simple format, but never at this scale. And we found it very interesting because it really gave us a different perspective on the data, different than what you would get with the traditional review. Joanna will present this afternoon another project we did on AI and education, where we did a traditional review at the same time, and it was completely different feel of the field. We do recognize, though, that it lacks a bit of depth. So now we have a qualitative analysis in progress for each theme. We look at the most cited papers, so we get a bit of an idea of really what is happening there. And the last one there is that it really gave us a very broad overview of the data to give us an idea of where we have gaps, where we have dense areas, and also explore other disciplines in a way we would not have normally done. So that is it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Constance. Excellent. We are a minute or two over, but I think we start a minute or two later. So rapturous applause for, for you as well. I'm going to pick up just one question that came up around what happened before 1990. So was the review targeting from 1990 onwards, or what happens to some work done with education and artificial intelligence before?
Nothing. No, we found nothing. No, it's not because there is nothing in the data set that it means there is never anything. There are some limitations of Web of Science, but I've done reviews with Web of Science before. It goes way before 1990s. That said, it might have been more in niche areas and not necessarily in education. There is also the fact that we could not look at anything around learning, which is really a shame because people might not talk about teaching or education, but they are still on learning. But the fact that it is a term in artificial intelligence made it absolutely impossible to, I mean, we would have had hundreds of thousands of articles if we had done that.
Right, right. I think the books were not included. It was only articles,
No,
right?
the books are not included because you don't get sufficient data in Web of Science, and they don't cover this kind of data properly. So you always have gaps that are systematic gaps, and I do not like systematic missing data. Like that is a huge issue for me. So I stayed with only the articles for that.
Excellent. Well, thank you, everybody, and thank you for